Millionaire leaves his safe wide open just to test the new maid. But he never expected her reaction. Artur Mendonça was a man used to control. A fortune built on strategy and suspicion made him someone who never left things to chance. So when he left the safe wide open in his office that morning, it wasn't carelessness, it was calculation. He wanted to test the new housekeeper, Laura. A quiet woman, with eyes that carried the calm of someone who's seen too much in life. That open safe wasn't a mistake. It was a carefully placed trap. He wanted answers without questions. But sometimes, when you dig holes for others, you're the first to fall in. The gesture seemed subtle, almost invisible, but it carried symbolic weight. It wasn't just about the money, the jewelry, or the papers inside. The safe represented trust, or rather, the absence of it. Testing someone like that says more about the tester than the tested. Laura didn't know it yet, but that open object in the middle of the room wasn't an invitation to fail. It was a mirror. And like all mirrors, it reflects without mercy. What Artur projected that day was an inner wound, the inability to trust, even when there's no reason to doubt. It's strange how some people believe they have the right to test others, as if they're somehow above them, holders of the truth. But the truth is, those who are always testing others live in fear. And fear, no matter how well disguised behind expensive suits or luxury offices, always finds a way to slip through the cracks. Artur thought he was in control of the game, but Laura, unknowingly, was already changing the rules. Because the real test wasn't hers. It was his. And that open safe was just the beginning of a story he would no longer be able to control. Maybe you've lived something like this, being silently judged without ever being given the chance to show who you really are. You know that feeling, walking into a room that feels like a minefield, just waiting for you to make one wrong step. That's exactly what this was. But life has a strange way of flipping the script, especially when we least expect it. And that's when Laura begins to show her true strength, not with grand speeches, but through small actions that quietly dismantle even the harshest judgments. Grief doesn't have a set ending, especially when it's mixed with guilt and years of unspoken silence. Since losing his wife in a tragic accident that still haunts his nights, Artur Mendonça stopped being a man and became a fortress. Not the kind made of steel, but one built from rigid routines, locked doors, and cold stares. The luxury around him didn't hide the emptiness. He still smiled at social events, but his eyes never shined again. What died with her wasn't just love, it was his trust in the world. Artur surrounded himself with protocols the way a wounded man guards an open scar. Every employee in his home was watched, every conversation measured, every gesture analyzed as a possible threat. It wasn't paranoia, it was protection. Pain, when left unhealed, becomes armor. And Artur wore his like someone who never wanted to be touched again. Even his oldest friends felt the distance. He might still keep their names in his phone book, but his heart? That he locked away, along with memories too painful to revisit. That coldness, deep down, was just fear in disguise. Fear of getting hurt again. Fear of caring and losing. Fear of being deceived. Tragedy taught him to doubt, to believe that everyone carries a hidden agenda. And that behavior isn't rare. How many people do you know who, after a painful loss, just shut down completely? Maybe you've been there, disappointed, heartbroken, and now keeping a safe distance from anything that once made you feel alive. We call it being careful. But sometimes, it's just unresolved sadness. Laura, unknowingly, entered that world like a new piece on a board where the game was already in motion. And the most curious part? She didn't try to break the rules. But her very presence began to challenge the logic of a man who no longer believed in anyone. Because sometimes, what frightens a hardened heart the most isn't the threat. It's the chance to feel something real again. Laura arrived the way wind does before a storm. Silent, steady, impossible to ignore. She was recommended by an agency known for selecting near-perfect professionals. Her resume was spotless, her references glowing, her conduct impeccable. But it only took a few days for Artur to start watching her differently. There was something in her calm that felt more like control than peace. And that made him uneasy. People that quiet often carry deep stories, or secrets too heavy to explain. She moved with precision, like an invisible choreography. She arranged books exactly as they were, brewed tea as if she knew the taste of whoever would drink it, cleaned the floor without leaving a trace. But what impressed Arthur most wasn't what she did, it was what she didn't say. Laura spoke little, listened much, and rarely showed any emotion. In a house where silence was already an old tenant, her presence created an invisible tension. Arthur didn't know whether to feel relieved or threatened by her. He tried provoking her, subtle questions, ambiguous gestures, even a few small mistakes made on purpose. But nothing seemed to shake her. It was like trying to read a book with no cover, no title, no blurb. And that quiet indifference slowly turned into obsession. He wanted to understand her, decode her, predict her next move. But this desire wasn't just about control, it was fear. Because for the first time in years, someone in his home was completely outside his emotional radar. And that made him vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced. Many people think true strength is loud, commanding, full of titles. But Laura was living proof that real power sometimes lies in silence. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who changes the atmosphere just by walking into the room? People like that pull us out of autopilot. They make us feel. And that can be uncomfortable, especially for those who've spent years trying not to feel anything at all. The strange thing was, the more Arthur tried to take back control, the more he found himself trapped in a mystery that was just beginning to unfold. Some seeds don't need much soil to grow, just the right mind at the right moment. And João Paulo knew exactly how to exploit that. During a seemingly harmless dinner, between laughter and wine glasses, he dropped a comment masked as casual curiosity. "Do you really trust that new maid?" Nothing more needed to be said. The seed of doubt had been planted, like poison in clear water. Arthur, who had been trying to ignore his unease, suddenly felt his stomach turn. João hadn't accused anyone, and that made it even more dangerous. Suspicion is like smoke. Once it's in the air, it spreads everywhere, even if there's no fire. And in Arthur's case, the fire had been burning for years, just hidden beneath layers of control. João's words triggered memories he tried hard to suppress. Former employees who betrayed him, fake friends who used his pain, even relatives who smiled to his face and stabbed him from behind. His mind, already trained to doubt, began building stories. And Laura, without even knowing it, became the lead character in all of them. João Paulo knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't a man who rolled dice, he played chess. Intelligent, vain, and quietly eyeing his uncle's inheritance, João saw what others didn't. Laura was more than just a maid. She was stirring something emotional in Arthur. And emotional instability, for someone who wants to seize power, is always an opportunity. By planting that doubt, João not only awakened ghosts from the past, he also repositioned himself in the spotlight, as someone who cared, who protected, who saw what no one else did. And if you think a single sentence can't change a life, maybe you're still underestimating the power of the right words at the right time. Sometimes, a suggestion hits harder than a direct accusation, because it doesn't impose, it provokes. And Arthur, though trying to keep up the appearance of rationality, could no longer see Laura with the same eyes. Her smallest actions were now scrutinized. What once looked like calm, now felt calculated. What seemed like kindness, now rang as manipulation. And all of this, without her uttering a single word. When doubt walks in, peace quietly walks out. Since João Paulo's comment, Arthur hadn't slept properly. The image of Laura walking through the hallways blurred into his nightmares. He needed proof. It was no longer enough to just observe or rely on instinct. So he did what distrustful men do when they want to stay in control without getting their hands dirty. He set up a silent plan. He installed discreet cameras in strategic spots throughout the house, especially near the safe, and turned a nearby room into his own private surveillance center. For days, Arthur would lock himself in that room, eyes glued to the screens, waiting for a mistake. Any slip, any sign that Laura wasn't who she appeared to be. And the strange thing, the more he watched, the less he understood. She kept doing everything with precision. No attempts to open drawers. No lingering glances where they didn't belong. No suspicious gestures. But to a man consumed by paranoia, even the absence of guilt can look like part of a larger plan. When the mind wants to confirm a fear, it creates signs where there's only routine. This behavior isn't rare, by the way. People who live in fear of betrayal tend to test the whole world, and they always find what they're looking for, even if they have to imagine it. Artur didn't realize that in trying to catch a lie, he was slowly losing what remained of his emotional sanity. It's like checking your partner's phone every night, hoping to find something. Even when you don't, peace is already gone. Vigilance becomes a vice. And the worst part? It's a lonely addiction. No one knows what he's doing, not even Laura, who continues her routine unaware that every step is being watched. But there was something Artur hadn't considered, the danger of watching too much. Because when you focus all your attention on someone else, you might stumble upon truths about yourself. And that's exactly what began to happen. While spying on Laura, he began to see his own scars more clearly. The ones he tried to hide with spreadsheets, guards, and control. And without even knowing, Laura was unlocking something much bigger than a safe. She was slowly opening a door that he had sealed shut years ago. Laura had always been a woman of careful actions, the kind who chooses silence over noise. When she noticed the safe left wide open, something inside her made her pause, even though she knew it wasn't her place to touch it. She stepped closer with reverence, as if entering sacred ground, and stood still for a moment, studying every detail. Instead of touching anything, she chose a simple yet deeply meaningful action. She wrote a short note and left it clearly visible, like a silent message meant for someone who truly needed to see it. Laura's gesture wasn't just about respect, it was a quiet act of trust. By avoiding any impulsive move, she showed that she knew exactly where she stood, and more importantly, who she was. For Artur, watching everything from his hidden room, that small act unlocked a part of him that had been bolted shut for a very long time. He didn't expect the answer to his suspicions to be so subtle and direct, a reminder that character isn't measured by grand gestures, but by the details. In that moment, the coldness that ruled him began to melt, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. That kind of reaction is rare. In a world run by impatience and rush, meeting someone who acts with such grace feels almost shocking. Laura didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but her demeanor spoke louder than words ever could. More often than not, true strength lies in respecting invisible boundaries, and that's something we can take into our own lives. Whether in personal or professional relationships, there are moments when silence is the best response, a bridge to rebuild trust. As Artur processed the weight of that note, a new kind of unrest began to rise within him. Laura had passed a test he didn't even know he'd created. And without realizing it, he started to ask himself, was all this suspicion really about her? Or was he, in fact, confronting his own ghosts? And this is where the story begins to unfold in a way no one could have seen coming. The note was short. Just a few lines written by hand, with clear and steady penmanship. Mr. Mendonça, I found the safe open this morning. I suggest reviewing the contents, just as a precaution. Sincerely, Laura. No accusations, no drama, no hesitation in her words. Just a direct, sober message, from someone with nothing to hide. And maybe that's exactly why it hit so hard. Artur had expected anything, but not transparency. That note served as a mirror, reflecting his own paranoia with stunning clarity. It was almost embarrassing to realize that, in his mind, he had already built a courtroom against her. And now, without Laura ever knowing, he found himself sitting in the defendant's chair. The trap he had so carefully set became a stage for her integrity, and for the smallness of his own methods. There was no justification that could ease his discomfort. The clean way she handled the situation exposed, unintentionally, all the distortions he had been feeding. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She didn't try to please. She simply told the truth. It's rare to find this kind of clarity in human relationships. In a time where so many people play roles to protect themselves, pretend to gain favor, or hide to avoid judgment, a simple act like that is almost revolutionary. Laura showed that integrity makes no noise, it just acts, without needing an audience. And maybe that's why it hurt Artur so deeply. Not because of her, but because of him. Because it was in that quiet note that he finally saw how clouded his view of the world had become. And that realization, especially for someone who built his life on certainty, can be devastating. But the strange thing is, sometimes, the fall of our certainties is exactly what the soul needs to breathe again. And as Artur held that note with trembling hands, he began to understand that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, someone was telling him the truth, without even looking him in the eye. And that disarmed him more than any words ever could. But there was still more to come, because Laura's presence wasn't just exposing his distrust. She was about to touch wounds he thought had long healed. The mind of a wounded man doesn't follow logic, it follows pain. Even with Laura's note still in his hands, Artur couldn't feel peace. Instead, a fresh wave of doubt washed over him. What if this is all part of the act, he thought. Her honesty seemed unquestionable. But his own past wouldn't allow him to accept it as pure truth. People had sworn loyalty to him before. People had cried in front of him with convincing, tearful eyes, only to later stab him in the back. Pain had reshaped his vision, and now he saw the world through cracked lenses. And if you still think a single sentence can't change a life, maybe you're underestimating the power of the right words spoken at the right time. Sometimes, a subtle suggestion hits harder than a direct accusation, because it doesn't impose, it intrigues. And Artur, though trying to maintain his appearance of rationality, was no longer seeing Laura through the same lens. Her smallest gestures now came under a magnifying glass. What once looked like calm now seemed calculated. What once felt like kindness began to sound like manipulation. All of it, without her uttering a single word. When doubt enters, peace quietly slips away. Artur hadn't slept well since João Paulo's comment. The image of Laura walking through the corridors of his house began to merge with his nightly nightmares. He needed proof. Watching from afar or trusting his instincts was no longer enough. So, he did what paranoid men do when they want to maintain control without getting their hands dirty. He set up a silent plan. Discreet cameras were installed at strategic points around the house, especially near the vault. He converted a neighboring room into a hidden headquarters. A control center. His war room. For days, Artur would lock himself in there for hours, eyes glued to the screens, waiting for a slip-up, a sign, no matter how small, that Laura wasn't who she appeared to be. But here's the twist. The more he watched, the less he understood. She moved with the same precision. No attempts to open drawers. No lingering stares where they didn't belong. Not a single suspicious gesture. Yet, to a mind poisoned by paranoia, even the absence of error feels like part of a master plan. When fear wants to prove itself right, it invents evidence. It turns routine into red flags. This behavior, by the way, is more common than we like to admit. People betrayed once often test everyone, and they always find what they're looking for, even if they have to imagine it. Artur didn't realize that, in his obsession to catch a lie, he was slowly losing what little remained of his emotional sanity. It's like someone who checks their partner's phone every night, hoping to find something, and even when they don't, the peace is already gone. Vigilance becomes an addiction. And the worst kind, a lonely one. No one knew what he was doing. Not even Laura, who simply followed her routine, unaware she was under surveillance. But there was one thing Artur hadn't considered. The danger of watching too much. Because when you fix all your eyes on someone else, you just might stumble across truths about yourself. And that's exactly what started happening. While watching Laura, Artur began seeing his own scars more clearly. The ones he'd hidden behind spreadsheets, guards, and control. And without knowing it, Laura was unlocking something far more complex than a vault. She was slowly opening a door he had sealed shut years ago. Laura had always been a measured woman, one who chose silence over noise. When she found the vault wide open, something in her told her to pause. She knew it wasn't her place to touch it. She approached slowly, like someone stepping into sacred ground, and stood still, observing every detail with care. Then, instead of laying a finger on anything, she did something simple, but powerful. She wrote a note and left it clearly visible. A quiet message for someone who needed to understand. Laura's action wasn't just about respect, it was a silent act of trust. By avoiding any impulsive reaction, she showed that she knew where she was, and more importantly, who she was. For Artur, who watched everything from behind the cameras, that single gesture unlocked a part of him that had been sealed shut. He didn't expect the answer to his doubts to come in such a subtle, disarming form. But there it was. A reminder that character isn't proven by grand gestures, but by details. And in that instant, the ice that had taken over him began to melt, even if he wouldn't admit it. That kind of reaction is rare. In a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, encountering someone who acts with such grace is almost shocking. Laura had nothing to prove, but her posture spoke louder than words. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is respect invisible boundaries. And that's something we can all take to heart. In love, in work, in life. Sometimes, silence is the bridge that starts to rebuild trust. As Artur sat with the impact of that note sinking in, a new kind of unease crept in. Laura had passed a test he didn't even know he was giving. And without realizing it, he began to wonder. Was this really about her? Or was he facing ghosts that had nothing to do with her? That's when the story took a turn no one could have seen coming. But Artur, used to well-orchestrated deceptions, had no idea what to do with this. His mind screamed it was all part of a plan. His heart, exhausted, begged for rest. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to remorse. Not for suspecting Laura, but for realizing how deeply suspicion had become his only way of staying safe. He stood before a woman who never used words to shield herself. She used gestures, silences, respect, and that disarmed him. Still, something inside him resisted. An old, buried pain that made him see truth through distorted lenses. It was as if fear had taken root in his soul. To trust again felt dangerous, like exposing a part of himself that had long since learned to hide. And in that silent room, between modest notes and uncomfortable truths, Artur understood. Maybe Laura wasn't the mystery. Maybe he was. And the fear that kept him from seeing what was right in front of him. Artur had always believed that every charitable act came with an agenda. That kindness was just another form of transaction. In the world where he built his fortune. A world of contracts, clauses, and caution. Genuine honesty was more myth than reality. That's why Laura unsettled him. Not for what she said, but for everything she didn't say. She didn't ask for favors. She didn't seek recognition. She showed no interest in anything beyond what she was entrusted with. Her clean, quiet presence began to chip away at the armor he had worn for years. He started watching her with different eyes. Not as an investigator, but as a man lost in front of something he had no name for. The way she folded her daughter's clothes. How she set the table even if she was eating alone with the child. How she cleaned the corners no one would ever see. Those tiny, invisible actions said more about her than any speech ever could. And for the first time, Artur wondered if maybe he had been wrong. If, in his obsession with anticipating betrayal, he had gone blind to what was truly real. But that new awareness didn't bring peace. It brought discomfort, because it meant admitting he had grown bitter. That maybe, just maybe, he had pushed away good people in the past. Laura wasn't the exception. She was a mirror, and through her, he was beginning to see the cracks in himself. What do you do with someone who doesn't play games? Who doesn't manipulate, doesn't attack, doesn't defend? It was like trying to decode a message written in purity. And no matter how hard he tried, Artur didn't know that language. That morning, Arthur returned earlier than usual. Before leaving again, he set up another test. Maybe the last. He left the drawer in his office slightly ajar. A stack of US dollars scattered among receipts and loose papers. Everything carefully placed to look like carelessness. But it was a trap. Cold, deliberate. He wanted to see how far Laura's honesty would go. He wanted a flaw, a slip, something to justify the wall he still kept between them. Hours later, he watched everything from hidden cameras. Eyes sharp like a hunter waiting for the prey to stumble. But Laura didn't hesitate. When she saw the open drawer, she frowned with faint confusion, then calmly closed it. She gathered the papers, arranged them into folders, slid the drawer shut, and went back to cleaning. As if nothing had happened. The dollars remained untouched. No curiosity. No fascination. Not even a flicker of doubt in her eyes. To her, it was just another day of work. To Arthur, it was anything but. Every move she made was a silent verdict. Against the ghosts he refused to let go. And when he saw the drawer back in place, money untouched, everything in order, he felt something he wasn't prepared to face. Shame. Shame for doubting her. Shame for testing her. Shame for reducing an honest woman into an emotional experiment. And most of all, for realizing that maybe, just maybe, Laura was everything he'd stopped believing could exist. Someone who was honest, even when no one was watching. That afternoon, on the marble kitchen counter, rested yet another note from Laura. Beside it, an envelope with the change and a neatly folded receipt. Every cent accounted for. Each item listed in rounded, careful handwriting. Medications, fruit, milk, baby soap. Even the coins were wrapped with precision. There was no rush, no carelessness. Just the same quiet grace with which she tucked in her daughter, or folded freshly washed clothes. To Laura, this wasn't some grand gesture. It was simply what's right. Something her mother had taught her long ago. Arthur stood before that table for a long time. He looked at the note, then at the envelope. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about what he saw reflected in it. A silent, invisible code of conduct that most eyes would overlook. There were no performances, no lessons to teach, just the purest kind of honesty. One that doesn't shout, doesn't need applause. It just is. And that disturbed him more than any accusation ever could. Holding the note between his fingers, Arthur felt the ground beneath his certainty crumble, inch by inch. In that moment, he realized he was witnessing something rare, perhaps even impossible to understand, through the logic he had always used to survive. Laura wasn't doing any of this to impress him. She wasn't angling for anything. She was simply like that. And that was what disarmed him the most. Laura didn't fit into any of the mental boxes Arthur had built over a lifetime. She wasn't fragile, nor aggressive. She didn't play victim, but didn't try to prove strength all the time either. She just was. Simple, direct, quietly unwavering. There were no games, no efforts to win favor. And maybe that's why she, unknowingly, had come to occupy such a large space within him. It was disorienting to live alongside someone who wanted nothing in return, who didn't try to bend the room to suit herself. Arthur watched her small gestures with growing unease. The way she cleaned without ever checking if he was looking. The way she tucked in her daughter, with a kind of tenderness that felt sacred. There were no masks, and that hurt. Because he had always waited for the moment. People revealed their dark side. He always knew when the coin would flip. But with Laura, there was no coin, no flip. Just this linear, unshakable truth that felt almost too pure for his suspicious eyes. That kind of integrity didn't bring comfort. Quite the opposite. It forced him to face the worst in himself. In the presence of someone who didn't manipulate, he saw himself as a man who only knew how to defend. And that shamed him in silence. Laura didn't need words to be different. She simply was. And that was enough to bring down everything he was still trying to hold upright. Artur didn't know when it happened. When he stopped seeing Laura as the agency's employee, and began seeing her as someone whole, complex, admirable. But the shift was there. Silent. Growing with every ordinary gesture. In the way she polished glasses until no trace remained. In the way she looked into her daughter's eyes. With a patience he had never known. Laura's presence was a constant lesson in dignity. Not the kind taught in books or boardrooms, but the kind you only recognize in the invisible details. For the first time in years, Artur felt something deeper than admiration. Respect. The kind that wasn't born of power, or credentials, or status, but from the truth with which she lived her life. She never tried to assert herself, never expected recognition, and yet, she carried a strength no one could ignore, a rare kind of courage, the courage to be good, even when no one's watching. That disarmed him. It made him feel small before a quiet kind of greatness. That feeling was unfamiliar to Artur. He had always lived surrounded by relationships built on interest or fear. To respect someone simply for who they were, without expecting anything in return, unbalanced him. And maybe, deep down, that's what scared him the most. Because to respect someone like that, he'd first have to admit that she had something he never did. Inner peace. João Paulo arrived unannounced, wearing that rehearsed smile and paternalistic tone Artur knew all too well. He sat across from him like someone offering protection, but every word dripped with poison. Careful with that woman, uncle. She's clever, knows exactly what she's doing. The phrases came wrapped in fake concern, but they carried the same underlying message. The fear of losing control, privilege, advantage. His words struck a nerve, not because they revealed anything about Laura, but because they reawakened old wounds Artur thought he had buried. Whispers of betrayals, shady deals, people who wore friendly faces while hiding knives behind their backs. But this time, something inside him hesitated. Laura didn't fit the narrative João Paulo was trying so hard to sell. As his nephew spoke, Artur watched him with unfamiliar clarity. For the first time, he saw beyond the polished surface. He saw the envy, the barely concealed unease, the desperation of a man afraid of a woman who exposed, without saying a word, everything fake around him. And for once, Artur began, cautiously, to ask himself, who actually benefits from my doubt? In a nearly defensive gesture, Artur opened the drawer and pulled out the notes Laura had left. The receipts folded with care, amounts written in neat, steady handwriting, and the change sorted into little envelopes. She's not playing any game, he said quietly. More to convince himself than his nephew. He placed the papers on the table, like evidence of a crime that never happened. João Paulo glanced at them with disdain, not even bothering to touch them. He gave a smug half-smile, shook his head, and said, "Uncle, the most dangerous con is always the slow one. The one that looks too clean, too perfect." His tone was soft, but laced with venom. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He simply planted doubt. Like a toxic seed he hoped would grow in silence. Artur remained silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the notes. For a split second, all that Laura represented, her simplicity, her consistency, her honesty, began to blur with the warnings he'd heard his entire life. And João Paulo knew it. His concern was nothing more than a veiled threat. Trusting her could cost you, again. Even with the proof in front of him, doubt came crawling back like an old companion. That night, Artur said nothing. He simply put the notes away, more carefully this time. as if they were pieces of a puzzle bigger than he could understand. As he walked through the house in silence, something in him shifted. Laura didn't bother him because she was suspicious. She bothered him because, in her quiet way, she revealed everything rotten around her. She was a mirror, and what he saw in that mirror were all the masks he had chosen to wear and accept. The next day, João Paulo returned, this time more intrusive, more mocking, trying harder to fuel the doubts. But now, Arthur looked at him differently. He noticed the discomfort in his voice, the unease behind his smile. And that's when it hit him. The real threat wasn't the quiet woman cleaning his home. It was the fear she sparked in those who had something to hide. The realization came quietly, like everything else about Laura. There were no grand speeches, no impulsive decisions, just a shift in perspective. He began watching more, not suspiciously, but attentively. Her gestures, her silences, the way she handled every task without needing praise. And deep down, he realized, Laura didn't need to explain herself. It was the world around her, including himself, that needed to relearn what it meant to be whole. Before, every move Laura made was filtered through suspicion. He watched her steps like a man waiting for the inevitable mistake. But something changed. He no longer looked for flaws. He looked for understanding. The scrutiny in his gaze gave way to a quiet curiosity. He started noticing the details. The way she folded cleaning cloths with care. How she left exact change without ever expecting a thank you. How she realigned books without drawing attention to herself. Laura never made speeches, but her conduct shouted. And Arthur, who had been fooled by beautiful words more times than he could count, was beginning to be moved by the power of honest silence. Little by little, he stopped seeing her as the maid, and began seeing her as a whole woman. A woman who didn't need to wear a mask to exist. A woman who didn't ask for space, and yet quietly occupied all of it. And somewhere between scrutiny and respect, something new was born. Admiration. A rare and unexpected spark in a man who had long buried his faith in humanity. Then came Flora. Laura's daughter, with her deep, silent eyes that seemed to speak volumes. The girl didn't talk, but her presence overflowed with life and connection. From a distance, Arthur watched as Flora approached her mother with a colorful drawing. A tiny treasure, crafted with great care. She held the paper delicately, as if sharing a sacred secret. Laura received it with a gentle smile. She knelt to Flora's eye level and touched the drawing as if it were her own heart. It was a simple scene, and yet it cracked something open inside Arthur. It was love's silent language. One that doesn't need words to be understood. In that moment, he saw something more true than all his past suspicions combined. Flora's gaze became a mirror, reflecting her mother's purity. And somehow, it dissolved what little doubt still remained. Arthur felt a new emotion stir, a mix of tenderness and reverence. Because that child, even without speaking, said everything that needed to be said. Sometimes, truth doesn't come through declarations. It lives in the quiet. In the small, unnoticed acts that carry the weight of something real. When Arthur found Laura's notebook, he didn't know what he was expecting. But it wasn't this. It wasn't a cold report or a list of chores. It was something far more intimate. Each page was a map of love and struggle, a daily journal, filled with notes about her daughter and the silent battle of a woman, doing everything to give her child the best life she could. Every line was a testament of meticulous care, a routine that went far beyond what the average eye could see. It spoke of small victories and daily challenges, of ways to stimulate Flora, worries about her health, tiny milestones in her development. It wasn't just a diary, it was a chronicle of resilience, a document of silent, sacred hope. Laura's handwriting made one thing clear. Her life was ruled by discipline, and, above all, a love so steady it gave everyday meaning. And Arthur, used to cold numbers and hard contracts, found himself staring into a world he'd never known. A world ruled not by profit or performance, but by the heart. Reading those pages was a jolt for Artur. For the first time, he was granted access to a part of Laura that wasn't meant for his eyes, and that unintentional invasion made him rethink everything. That simple, unassuming notebook dismantled his suspicions even further. It was a silent mirror of her soul, tangible proof that this was someone who lived with integrity, even when no one was watching. And somehow, that disarmed him completely. Artur had never imagined walking into that clinic as just a regular man, stripped of title and power. Disguised in plain clothes and a neutral expression, he walked the quiet halls, hearing his footsteps echo like a reminder that nothing here could be faked. At the front desk, a kind woman answered his questions with a sincerity he'd long been searching for, but never expected to find. "Laura is an extraordinary mother," she said with conviction. "Flora is special, yes, but full of life and growing every day." There was no malice in the woman's words, no hidden meanings, no conveniently twisted stories meant to justify suspicion. It was a clear, pure truth, the kind Laura had been living all along: integrity, dedication, and a quiet fight to raise her daughter with dignity. That simplicity, so obvious, yet so often overlooked, struck Artur with unexpected force. In that moment, he felt the weight of every prejudice and doubt crashing at his feet. The suspicions that had consumed him, the traps he'd set, the cruel tests, they all seemed meaningless in the face of that clarity. It was as if the fog clouding his vision finally lifted, revealing a world where truth didn't need to be questioned to be real. And in that silence, something began to shift within him. That afternoon, Artur did something he had never done before. He let go of the tricks, the suspicion, and offered a gesture that was simple and genuine. He bought art supplies, colored pencils, thick sketchbooks, soft brushes, and, without a word, laid them gently in the garden, just beneath the window to Flora's room. It was a silent offering, an invitation for the little girl to express all that lived within her, beyond what words could reach. He didn't expect an immediate reaction. But from a distance, hidden behind a tree, he watched as the gift was discovered. Flora appeared at the window, her eyes lighting up, a shy smile breaking across her face as her small fingers touched the pencils and brushes as if they were precious treasures. No words were spoken, no explanations exchanged, just a moment of pure connection that said more than anything else could. The silence of that gesture held more truth than any declaration. Artur felt something stir inside him. A quiet blend of hope and respect that he didn't quite know how to name. The gift wasn't about the materials. It was about the trust he was slowly beginning to place in that family, in that quiet world he once kept at arm's length. And that timid smile, those tearful eyes, were the purest confirmation that real conversations often happen without a single word. He sat down on the garden bench, watching the sun go down as the wind gently stirred the trees. For the first time, something inside him truly shifted, not because Laura had proven anything, but because he was finally ready to learn how to trust. Trust, he realized, wasn't something imposed on others. It was a gift we give ourselves, a quiet act of courage to tear down the walls we build from old wounds and fear. That simple gesture, buying colored pencils and leaving them in the garden, became more than just an offering to a child. It became a symbol of his own rebirth. He was no longer playing the game of surveillance and traps. He was, for the first time, allowing himself to be vulnerable, to believe that life could be different. That honesty wasn't a rare exception, but a very real possibility. And for a man so used to suspicion, that was almost a silent miracle. As the sky darkened, Artur understood. The true challenge wasn't in deciding who was worthy of trust, but in allowing himself to be someone who could trust. A difficult lesson, a long path still ahead, but it started right there, in that quiet moment of surrender. A moment that needed no words to be understood. Because sometimes, the greatest truths reveal themselves in the simplest of gestures. In the days that followed, Flora began to glance at Artur with curious, thoughtful eyes. Not questioning, but quietly observing. She didn't need to speak to communicate. Her gaze held a depth that went beyond language. And Artur learned to respond with nods, small waves, simple kindnesses that whispered, "I'm here," without the burden of elaborate explanations. It was a silent exchange built on presence and mutual respect. That unspoken bond between them grew with the care of something sacred, untouched by the noise of the outside world. There were no loud promises, no forced declarations. Just a quiet understanding, as if they both knew that deep connection doesn't require words. It lived in the stillness of shared moments, growing stronger in the absence of expectations. With every exchanged glance, every returned gesture, Artur felt something open within himself. That little girl, who didn't need to speak to be heard, was teaching him to honor silence and the power of genuine presence. And between them, trust was taking root, not through grand speeches, but through a quiet humanity that defied fear and doubt. Then came the moment Artur had long delayed. He opened the office door, carrying the weight of everything he hadn't said. He asked Laura to sit with him, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had silently waged a battle between mistrust and truth. He revealed it all: the open safe, the hidden cameras, the notes he had preserved, the receipts he had kept as evidence of a near unbelievable honesty. He expected a reaction, perhaps defensiveness or frustration. But what he got was something else entirely. Laura looked him straight in the eye, calm and unflinching. "I didn't come here to win anyone over with words," she said, steady and clear, declaring a truth that needed no embellishment. There was no resentment, no self-pity. Just the quiet certainty of someone who knows her worth and refuses to be shaken by another's judgment. That moment wasn't just a reckoning, it was the breaking down of the masks they both had worn for protection. For the first time, Artur realized he no longer needed to control or second-guess everything. There was something about that exchange that transcended money, contracts, and evidence. It was about dignity, respect, and the hard-earned ability to truly see another person. In the silence of that room, something profound shifted, not just in Laura, but in him too. When Artur finally asked, not out of suspicion, but genuine curiosity, why she had done it all, expecting perhaps a monologue or a tearful explanation, Laura simply replied with a calm that cut through time. "I just did what any decent person would do." Her words weren't arrogant, nor were they pleading. They were clean, solid, crystalline, and they echoed louder than any rehearsed speech ever could. That answer disarmed Artur more deeply than anything else had. He, who had lived his life tangled in motives and manipulation, finally saw what true integrity looked like, the kind that doesn't seek applause or recognition, but simply stands tall on the quiet strength of doing what's right. And in that presence, he began to question everything he thought he knew about what truth really means. Laura wasn't defending her actions because she needed to justify herself. She simply acted that way because it was her essence. And that essence was something rare, almost incomprehensible to Artur, who bore the marks of deep distrust. That moment was more than a conversation. It was an invitation for him to revisit his own definition of honesty and integrity. Artur didn't hesitate to mention João Paulo's name during that delicate conversation in the office. He spoke of the poisonous words, the insinuations his nephew made, trying to plant distrust where there was only truth. Laura listened in silence, her eyes fixed on his, carrying a coldness that wasn't anger but the calm defense of someone who had been judged too much in life. "Your nephew lives in a world where every gesture has a price," she replied, her voice firm and steady. "I want nothing from you." Laura's response echoed through the room like a blow of reality. Artur realized how much that sentence carried the experience of someone who had faced unfair suspicions and understood, better than he did, the cruel game of distrust. For João Paulo, everything was merchandise, everything had a value measured in gains and losses. But Laura was not part of that world. She was different, a universe apart, where respect isn't bargained for and honesty isn't a currency. Artur felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief for finally seeing the truth, sadness for realizing that the world they lived in was often ruled by hidden interests and unfounded fears. He knew that to protect that fragile truth, he would have to fight more than his own doubts. He would have to face the shadows João Paulo represented. And that was only the beginning. Laura shared with Artur something that seemed small to many, but for her represented an entire universe. Flora, her daughter, had uttered a word. Mom. The sound, fragile and uncertain, was more than a simple syllable. It was a milestone, a silent victory against the silence that had enveloped her for so long. For Laura, every sound of that word was a giant step in the journey of love and struggle she fought alongside her daughter. Hearing that, Artur felt something unexpected growing inside him. It wasn't just the news, but the raw emotion it carried, hope renewed even in the hardest moments. He found himself imagining that little girl, once so reserved, now showing signs of a world opening up, a connection beyond words, a silent rebirth that touched his own soul. It was a moment that pulled him from his comfort zone. Artur, a businessman used to dealing with numbers and hard facts, now felt the weight of genuine emotion in a victory that couldn't be measured in figures or contracts. It was the power of life, resilience, hope, that, even when all seemed lost, found a way to bloom. Artur didn't wait for Laura to express gratitude. Before she could say a word, he broke the silence with a firm and unexpected decision. Her salary would be doubled, no secret envelopes, no hidden conditions, no more waiting or tests. This isn't charity. It's long overdue recognition, he said, looking her in the eyes with a sincerity that needed no words. A simple gesture, but filled with meaning, a silent way to repair what had been denied for so long. Laura received the news with the same silence that always accompanied her. She said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes, surprise, respect, a mix of relief and dignity. She didn't need applause or celebrations to know her work was worth far more than she had ever been paid. She accepted the gesture with the humility and strength that always defined her, understanding that this recognition was a milestone, not only financial, but emotional, a turning point. For Artur, that moment was more than a mere administrative decision. It marked the end of an era of suspicion and endless tests. By doubling Laura's salary, he was also freeing himself from his own fears, allowing himself to trust and value what he once judged through suspicious eyes. And so, without grand speeches, a delicate chapter came to a close, opening space for something new, slow, silent, but genuine. After months of watching every gesture Laura made, Artur finally realized the true judgment wasn't hers, it was his own. All those proofs, notes, hidden cameras, deep doubts, they had actually been a test of his own ability to trust and open up to what was genuine. And, to his surprise, perhaps for the first time in his life, he felt he had passed that silent test. The change in the house was more than physical. It was a palpable transformation in the air, the atmosphere, the energy that filled every room. Artur, once a closed, distrustful man, was now present not just physically, but with a lighter heart and an open mind. The house, once marked by silent tensions, began to breathe a new air, one of hope and acceptance. He understood that true approval doesn't come from external eyes, but from inner recognition, the courage to confront one's own fears and prejudices. Artur was no longer the man who installed cameras to spy. Now, his presence was an invitation to truth and trust, a presence that no longer withdrew, but welcomed and strengthened the most human parts of that home. Calls from João Paulo began arriving more frequently, desperate attempts to maintain control over the situation. Every ring was an unwelcome reminder of the past, the suspicions and manipulations the nephew used to spread. But for the first time, Artur chose not to answer. He let the phone fall silent, like closing a door he no longer wished to open. There was no fear, no guilt, only a firm decision to walk away from the poisonous noise. Artur's silence was more powerful than any reply could have been. João Paulo, used to dominating through veiled threats and planted doubts, now faced a void he couldn't control. Each unanswered call was a defeat for the nephew, a harsh reminder that his power was slipping away before the quiet resistance of his uncle. For Artur, that silence was freeing. He had seen too much, understood too much, and refused to be a hostage to João Paulo's manipulations any longer. The absence of response wasn't cowardice, it was a conscious choice to preserve his peace and integrity. The false world João Paulo built was crumbling slowly, and Artur finally breathed free, a man who had learned to distinguish what truly matters from what only seemed to. In the silence of his office, Artur opened a dusty folder he'd carried for years, full of documents he had long avoided facing. Page after page, contract after contract, he began to see what his stubborn eyes had ignored for so long. Subtle manipulations, hidden clauses, power games that were never explicitly illegal, but always worked as silent traps to maintain control. It was a past that needed rewriting, not with resentment, but with clarity and courage. As he read, a mix of frustration and determination took hold of him. There was no theft, no major fraud to expose, but there was a system built to bind people, to keep everything within an unfair game. He realized it wasn't about lost money, but stolen dignity. And in that moment, Artur made a firm choice. He would no longer allow those invisible chains to shape his life or his company. Determined to turn the page, he began quietly planning how to dismantle that game of control. It wasn't an external battle, it was an internal war, a journey to reclaim his own voice, power, and truth. And that decision, though discreet, would be the first step toward freeing not only himself, but all who depended on him. In that tense meeting, Artur sat beside the accountant and the lawyer with a determination no one there had ever seen before. He opened the folder of documents and, with a firm voice and without hesitation, began to revoke all the powers he had granted to his nephew, João Paulo. Every signature was an act of liberation, a definitive break from the past that had long imprisoned him. João Paulo, expecting to continue his silent dominance, stormed into the room furious, but he found no usual submission. Enraged, the nephew tried to throw accusations at Laura, a desperate attempt to turn the tables and tarnish her reputation. But Artur met him with a calm that froze the very air around them. Without flinching, he uttered a phrase that cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "I'm doing this because I'm tired of trusting those who use trust as currency." Those words were not just an end, they were a beginning, a declaration that his patience had limits and that he was ready to rebuild his world on his own terms. For the first time, João Paulo saw his uncle with different eyes. No longer as someone submissive, but as a man finally taking control of his life and destiny. The change was palpable, and though tension still lingered, Artur knew he had taken the most important step toward his freedom. Deep down, he felt that final cut was also a gesture of protection for Laura and Flora, a clear line between what was true and what was manipulation. Artur looked into João Paulo's eyes with a serenity that commanded respect. There was no need for yelling or scandal, just the quiet firmness of a man who had finally decided to take the reins of his own life. That moment was more than a simple family rupture. It was the breaking of years of passivity, of accepting manipulations and doubts that had corroded him from within. It was the first step of a new path, guided by the courage to own his own destiny. The decision to cut ties with his nephew was not easy. It demanded strength to let go of bonds that, though toxic, were part of a long and complicated history. But Artur understood that breaking free was necessary. He was leaving behind the weight of suspicion and distrust that had eaten away at his soul, opening space for hope and the building of a truer life. In that instant, the house that once felt like a battleground took on a new meaning. It was the place where transformation began, where difficult choices translated into real freedom. And Artur, with the calm of one who has learned to value inner peace, knew that despite the pain, he had made the right decision, the decision that finally set him free. Flora, with her natural delicacy, was drawing intently in the corner of her room, spreading colors over the white paper. The drawing was simple, but carried a depth Artur hadn't expected. A man in a suit, with a red flower pinned to his chest. Laura smiled and whispered almost reverently, "She said it's you." That small phrase carried enormous weight. It was the first time Flora tried to express something she still couldn't say in words. Artur slowly bent down beside the girl, feeling the world slow down around him. Reaching out to her was as natural as it was necessary. When Flora's tiny fingers touched his, for a moment silence spoke louder than any word ever could. That gentle touch held a universe of emotions, trust, acceptance, and the silent promise that, despite everything, a genuine beginning was taking place. In that moment, Artur realized the drawing was more than a simple child's depiction. It was a symbol of the bond beginning to form between him and Flora, a connection that would transcend the lack of words and speak directly to the heart. It was the unspoken recognition of a presence that, even without being verbalized, was already making all the difference in that little girl's life. Back in his office, Arthur sat before a desk that seemed to carry the weight of all the years gone by. Instead of opening folders filled with contracts and wills, he now wrote a new document, not a record of assets or fortunes, but a life script with clear instructions for a different existence. For the first time, his decisions no longer revolved around inheritance, but around what truly mattered to preserve in heart and soul. Every word written in that document carried deep meaning, a silent commitment to himself and to those he loved. Arthur was shaping a new story, where values, respect, and truth took center stage. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was the expression of an inner transformation that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of those around him. In that folder, there was no space for disputes or selfish ambitions. There was purpose, a guiding light behind every decision, reflecting the courage of a man who finally saw what truly mattered. And so, as the ink dried, Arthur knew he was building a legacy that would outlast any material fortune, a legacy made of life, truth, and love. With the arrival of winter, the house that once seemed cold and silent began to come alive. The cozy aroma of freshly baked bread filled the rooms, bringing warmth and comfort beyond the physical surroundings. The curtains, once shut tight like barriers against the world, now remained open, letting sunlight pour in and illuminate every corner, revealing a renewed and welcoming atmosphere. Flora's childish laughter echoed throughout the house, filling spaces once marked by tense silence and distrust. No grand repairs or structural changes were necessary. The transformation was in the eyes of those who lived there, in the ability to see the value of simplicity, presence, and truth. The house, like a living organism, breathed again, pulsing with the hope and love that blossomed inside it. Arthur felt, day by day, that the place was becoming more than just a building. It was turning into a true home. A space where presence, honesty, and respect took root deeply, strengthening not only the walls but the hearts that lived within them. It was living proof that the truest change begins from within, in the way we see and connect with the world around us. In a gesture that seemed simple but carried immense weight, Arthur handed Laura a sealed envelope. It wasn't a raise, nor a traditional reward. It was something much deeper, a housing contract. The words written inside didn't speak of obligations or common rights, but of a silent and powerful invitation for Laura and Flora to no longer live there as employee and employee's child, but as part of the house, part of the family. The gesture touched Laura in a way she hadn't expected. Behind the formality of the paper was the recognition of her value as a person, not just for the work she did, but for the sincere presence she had brought into that home. It was an invitation to belong, to be present in body and soul, to share not only the physical space but the history, the trust, and the future of that house. By handing over the envelope, Arthur showed that true salary isn't always financial. Sometimes, what truly transforms lives is the feeling of belonging, the certainty that you are not alone, that you are valued and welcomed. And in that silent delivery, a new chapter began, one made of respect, inclusion, and hope. Flora, with her still timid and discovering speech, began calling Arthur Sutu, an innocent and sweet attempt to say, "Su Arthur, Mr. Arthur." It was a simple word, almost a child's slip, but it carried a world of meaning. Arthur heard it for the first time and, instead of correcting her pronunciation, chose to embrace that imperfect form, finding in it a truth that formal words could never express. That small gesture from the girl brought unexpected emotion to Arthur. It was as if that sound, born from childhood's purity and simplicity, captured the essence of the relationship beginning to blossom between them. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a symbol of genuine affection, an invisible bond uniting two distinct worlds in a way that adult words never could. For Arthur, that Sutu was more than a mispronounced word. It was a silent gift, proof that despite difficulties and differences, there was room for genuine care and connection. It was a reminder that sometimes, beauty lies precisely in the imperfections that make us human and bring us closer together. Flora ran to Arthur holding a new drawing. It showed a simple house, a tree beside it, and three smiling figures holding hands, a woman, a child, and a man in a suit with a red flower on his chest. Above the scene, in uneven and earnest letters, it read, "Our home." Arthur held the paper carefully, as if it were a sacred contract. No words were needed. None were spoken. Seeing the drawing, Laura's heart tightened, not with pain, but with a tenderness that disarmed her. That word, our, carried more weight than any speech. It was the silent confirmation of something built in the details, a home that didn't depend on inheritance, blood, or surname, but on choice. And there, on that paper colored with childish strokes, lay the most beautiful choice of all. With tearful eyes, Arthur hung the drawing on the living room wall. Not for decoration, but out of reverence. That crooked, vibrant sheet sealed what the heart already knew: they belonged to each other. Not as boss and employee, not as benefactor and protected, but as people who recognized each other in affection. In that instant, more than any signed document, that was the true deed of a home. In the silent cellar, Arthur carefully labeled a series of bottles with the name, Flora, written in delicate handwriting. The batch was small, almost homemade, but carried the weight of a cycle ended and another just beginning. Below the name, in almost imperceptible tiny letters, was a phrase: "What gives meaning to a house isn't the walls, but those who stay." It wasn't a product for sale. It was a silent offering to the memory of what really matters. Holding one of the bottles, Laura smiled with teary eyes. She understood what it meant. It wasn't wine, but a tribute. A symbol of transformation. The man who once bottled inheritances now sealed affections. Flora, unknowingly, had named the most precious harvest in Arthur's life: the ability to bond without fear, without contracts, without reservations. Later, during a simple dinner, Arthur poured the wine naturally, as if no profound declaration was behind it. Flora, amid laughter and crumbs of bread, toasted with juice. And he smiled. Not for the taste of the wine, but for the name on the label. Because now he knew, some things don't need decades to last forever. They just need to take root in the right place. Sitting in the old rocking chair on the porch, Arthur watched the sunset bathed in gold. In front of him, Flora ran through the vineyard as if dancing with the wind, and Laura, in the distance, laughed with a joy that filled the silence. There were no grand events, no announcements. But there, in that simple moment, everything pulsed with intensity. The house, once just a structure, now breathed. It had a soul. It had people. Arthur closed his eyes for a brief second. There was no longer the weight of wills, nor the echo of old silences. There was peace. Not a peace of an ending, but of a new beginning. One born not of conquest, but of surrender. He hadn't needed to control, plan, or buy this new life. It simply arrived, through the front door, without demands, without contracts, without pomp. It just came, and stayed. The wine ages in the cellar. The plants bloom in the garden. And inside him, a man once hardened by formalities finally learns to love without fences. The ending he feared never came. Because sometimes, the real ending isn't a farewell, it's permission. And in that sunset, Arthur gave himself something great: life.